The Endless Mercy was not a quiet ship under ordinary circumstances. It was a working vessel, a medical frigate running at operational capacity in the aftermath of a major engagement, and that meant noise, the constant layered noise of a ship doing difficult work under pressure. Corridors hummed with the movement of medical staff between wards. Equipment cycled and beeped and processed. Gurneys moved. Voices crossed in a dozen languages, the ship's translation systems filling in the gaps with the smooth, slightly artificial cadence that no amount of technological refinement had ever managed to make sound entirely natural. In the recovery wards, patients made the sounds that patients made: pain and confusion and relief and grief, the full register of what it meant to be alive on the other side of something that had tried very hard to make you otherwise. Medical Bay 7 was different. It was the largest bay on the ship, a space originally designed for the treatment of Kalahari heavy infantry, whose species averaged 4 meters in height and required equipment scaled accordingly, and which had been adapted over the years for whatever large-scale biological emergency the Coalition's conflict zones produced. The bay could, in theory, accommodate a creature up to 20 meters in length with reasonable clearance for medical staff to work around it. Vorthanac was 38 meters from wingtip to wingtip, with his wings folded. They had managed, through a combination of careful arrangement and a pragmatic decision, to accept that certain pieces of standard bay equipment were simply not going to survive the process. To get him positioned on the reinforced central platform with his worst wounds accessible and the bay doors still functional. He occupied the space the way a geological feature occupied a landscape, not filling it so much as redefining it, making the bay itself feel like an afterthought, a structure that existed at his convenience rather than the other way around. The medical staff who had attempted to treat him were not small creatures. The Medhari were, by most galactic standards, substantial. Their evolved forms ran to 2 meters in height on their primary limbs, with 8 total appendages of varying function distributed along a body plan that had unnerved more than a few species encountering them for the first time. They were not easily intimidated. Their professional training specifically included psychological preparation for treating hostile patients, creatures in pain who responded to approach with aggression, which was a common enough situation in field medicine that the Coalition's medical training programs devoted entire modules to managing it. None of that training had been designed with a war dragon in mind. The first attempt had been textbook. Senior Surgeon Televry, 40 years of trauma experience, commendations across 3 campaigns, the kind of professional whose presence in a crisis had a measurable calming effect on the staff around her, had approached Vorthac's position from the recommended angle, moving slowly, keeping her limbs in non-threatening configuration, using the low-frequency vocalization that the Medhari employed specifically for hostile patient situations. It was a sound with a long evolutionary history behind it, a frequency that had demonstrable calming effects on a remarkable range of biological nervous systems across multiple species. The Coalition's medical database had only a handful of entries where it had failed entirely. She had gotten within 9 meters before Vorthac's head came off the platform. Not in the lazy, warning way that large animals sometimes raise their heads to track movement. Straight up, fast, with the coiled precision of a creature whose body had spent decades learning exactly how much force any given motion required and wasting none of it. The sound that accompanied the movement hit the bay like a physical thing, a deep, resonant pressure wave that Televry felt in her secondary respiratory organs before her primary senses processed it as sound. Her emergency retreat system, a standard-issue piece of equipment for any medic working with large hostile fauna, essentially a very fast, very insistent harness that could move a person 6 meters backward in under a second, activated before her conscious mind had finished forming the intention to retreat. She was back behind the observation line before Vorthac's head had fully extended. The second attempt had been more cautious, greater distance, slower approach, different frequency range. A colleague accompanying Televry at a 45-degree offset to divide the dragon's attentional focus in a technique that had worked reliably with every large predatory species in the database. They made it to 11 meters. Vorthac's response was faster and louder than the first time, as though he had studied their approach and decided to calibrate his deterrence upward accordingly. The third attempt had involved sedation. It was a calculated risk. War dragon metabolisms were not fully mapped in the Coalition's biological database, which contained extensive notes on Drathkai physiology in the context of military performance, but was considerably thinner on the subject of medical treatment. Partly because war dragons had historically been extremely reluctant to submit to medical examination, and partly because the number of medical professionals who had attempted it under non-consensual conditions was very small for reasons that required no elaboration. The compound the pharmacology team selected was the most powerful broad-spectrum sedative in the ship's inventory, delivered by aerosolized dispersion through the bay's atmospheric systems so that no one needed to approach the patient to administer it. It had taken hold. For approximately 4 minutes, Vorthac's movements had slowed, his head had dropped, and his breathing had shifted into something deeper and less labored. The medical team had mobilized immediately, moving in with the organized efficiency of professionals who understood that their window was limited and precious. The sedative had lasted 6 minutes total. The team had gotten within range before he was fully alert again. They had learned that much, but not close enough for actual contact before the amber eyes opened and the sound started again. The fourth attempt, made in the immediate aftermath of the sedation failure while the medical team was still trying to determine if a second dose was feasible, had produced the response that had taken 12 centimeters off the observation window's reinforced frame. After that, the consensus was quiet and unanimous and deeply uncomfortable. They had run through the options. There were no more conventional options. The dragon would not be touched, and the dragon was dying, and those two facts were going to resolve themselves in the worst possible way within a time frame that the medical team's projections were distressingly specific about. Commander Silvani had been watching from the observation area for the better part of 3 hours by the time the Coalition liaison officer joined her. His name was Prakash Arin, a human, as it happened, though that was not yet relevant in any way that either of them was consciously considering. He was Coalition diplomatic and logistics staff, present on the endless mercy for the standard post-engagement coordination that followed any major battle in this sector, and he had been informed of the situation with Vorthanac in the careful, factually dense way that ship command briefed liaison officers when they wanted to communicate the severity of something without triggering any of the several complicated oversight mechanisms that Coalition liaison officers were empowered to activate. He stood beside Silvani and looked through the reinforced glass at Vorthanac and said nothing for a long moment, because there was a period of simply absorbing what he was looking at before speech became appropriate. The dragon's scale patches were darker than they had been in the morning sensor readings Arin had reviewed. He could see that even without any particular biological expertise, whatever light had been inherent to those scales was going out, the way embers went out, slowly in patches, the boundary between the living parts and the dying parts moving with a patience that had nothing to do with kindness. Every few minutes, a low sound moved through Vorthanac. It traveled through the reinforced glass and through the deck plating and through everything between the observer and the observed, and it arrived without any translation assistance because it did not require any. It was the sound of something enduring. Not resigned, endurance and resignation were not the same thing, and whatever Vorthanac was doing, it was not resignation. It was the sound of something that had decided, on some fundamental level below strategy and calculation, that it was simply going to continue until it couldn't. Arin found it more affecting than he had expected. "How long?" he asked. "At the current rate of infection progression." Silvani did not look away from the glass. 48 hours before the question changes from treatment to outcome management." She paused. "Perhaps less. The burn wounds are the primary concern. The surface area involved creates a systemic load that compounds everything else. If we could address even the burns, the prognosis changes significantly." "And he won't. He will not permit approach. We have exhausted our methodology for non-consensual treatment of hostile large fauna patients. The sedative pathway is closed. A second dose at the concentration required would create its own risk. And the delivery window after the first dose tells us we cannot move quickly enough to complete any meaningful treatment before he recovers awareness." She finally turned to look at Arin, and her 4 upper eyes blinked in the slow sequence that, in Medhari expression, indicated not distress but something adjacent to it, a state her species described as the recognition of a boundary. He is choosing this. Arin looked at her. Choosing to die. Choosing not to be touched. She said it without judgment, without clinical distance, and without the particular kind of professional detachment that medical staff sometimes deployed as armor against situations that resisted their expertise. She said it as a plain fact about a creature that had every right to make it, even if it was killing him. They are not the same choice, though they are producing the same outcome. The silence between them lasted until the next low rumble moved through the ship. There must be something, Arin began. There is one option remaining. Silvani turned back to the glass. I have been considering it for the past hour, and I keep arriving at the same conclusion, which is that it is simultaneously the least promising approach available and the only one we have not tried. She folded two of her hands behind her back, a Medhari posture that indicated a decision being committed to despite reservation. The Endless Mercy has a human veterinarian attached to the large fauna support unit, Dr. Emeka Okafor. He joined the ship's complement 6 months ago as part of the Coalition's expanded non-humanoid patient care initiative. Arin processed this. You want to send a veterinarian in there? I want to send Dr. Okafor in there, Silvani said precisely. The distinction matters. He's not, his training isn't. His training is in large animal medicine. Specifically in the treatment of large, non-communicative, frequently hostile patients who cannot be sedated effectively and who must be persuaded rather than compelled to accept treatment. She glanced at Arin. Can you tell me how that differs from our current situation? Arin looked through the glass. Vorthac's chest rose and fell. The dark patches on his scales had spread another centimeter since Arin had arrived at the observation window. He was almost certain of it, though he didn't want to be. He's a war dragon, Arin said. He's not an animal. No, Silvani agreed. He is considerably more dangerous than any animal Dr. Okafor has previously treated, and he is considerably more aware than any animal, and he has considerably more capacity to choose his response to any approach. She paused. I am not sending Dr. Okafor in because I think Vorthanac is an animal. I am sending Dr. Okafor in because every medical specialist trained in treating people has already failed, and Dr. Okafor is trained in something different. Another pause shorter. He is trained in earning trust that has not been offered. The liaison officer was quiet for a long moment. Through the glass, Vorthanac shifted slightly, a small movement, the adjustment of a creature trying to find a position that hurt less and not finding it, and the sound that came with the movement was different from the warning sounds. It was lower and more private, and it had the quality of something not intended to be heard. You want to send someone who might actually come back out, Arin said. He wasn't sure afterward whether he meant it as a question or a statement or something else entirely. It landed somewhere in between. I want to send someone who might go in without triggering an immediate defensive response, Silvani said. The two things are related. She exhaled, a long, careful breath that her species used to mark transition, the closing of one line of thinking before another opened. The Drathkai have extensive cultural traditions around the concept of approach. It is, in their history, a ritualized thing. The way one being moves toward another carries meaning that precedes any action taken upon arrival. Every medic we have sent in has moved like a medic. Efficiently, purposefully, with the particular directional intent of someone who knows where they are going and what they intend to do when they get there. She let that sit for a moment. Dr. Okafor, by the nature of his work, has learned to move differently. She found him in the secondary staff lounge on Deck 7. It was late in the ship's night cycle, or what passed for night on a vessel that technically never stopped operating, but dimmed its corridor lighting between 2200 and 0600 as a concession to the circadian rhythms of its majority humanoid staff. The lounge was empty except for Dr. Okafor, who was sitting at the far table with a tablet in one hand and a cup of coffee that had clearly been warm at some point earlier in the evening in the other, reading with the focused attention of someone who had found a flow state and was reluctant to surface from it. He was not physically imposing. Silvani noted this with the evaluative precision of a medical professional assessing a variable. He was a human male of average height, broad-shouldered in the way of people who had done physical work for a long time, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples and hands that bore the particular kind of scarring that came from years of working with creatures that sometimes expressed their distress through their teeth or claws. He was, by any measurable standard, a small person to be sending into a bay with a war dragon. He looked up when she entered, and she had the immediate impression, without being able to precisely identify why, that he was a person accustomed to being sought out with bad news in the middle of the night. He had that quality of someone who had learned not to be startled by urgency, because urgency had come to find him often enough that he had reached an accommodation with it. "Commander Silvani," he said. Not a question. He had been briefed on the senior medical staff when he came aboard. He made a point of it with any new posting. "Sit down, you want to tell me about the dragon." She sat. She looked at him across the table. The ship hummed around them both. "He will die," she said, because she was a Medhari and the Medhari did not approach the truth from the side when going directly was available. "The wounds are manageable but not without intervention. He refuses every medic we send. We have tried everything within our standard methodology and several things outside it." She placed her upper hands flat on the table. "I am here because you are the only option we have not yet tried, and I want to be honest with you about what that means before I ask you to consider it." Emeka Okafor set down his coffee cup. He set down his tablet. He gave her the complete attention of a person who understood that complete attention was sometimes the most important thing you could offer another person, and he said, "Tell me everything about him." "Not the wounds, him, who is he?" Silvani looked at him for a moment, then she began to talk. Outside the viewport at the end of the lounge, the debris field of Gentara drifted in its slow, patient orbits around the orange star, and 4 decks above them, the greatest warrior the Coalition had ever fielded lay in a medical bay in the dark, too wounded to survive and too proud to ask for help, waiting for something that neither of them had a name for yet. The coffee went cold. Neither of them noticed. The vet and the dragon, Emeka Okafor, had learned the first and most important rule of his profession, not in a classroom or a training facility, or from any of the textbooks that lined the shelf above his desk, but from his uncle Chukwu Emeka, who had kept goats on a small farm outside Enugu and who had told him. When Emeka was 7 years old, and trying to approach a sick animal that did not want to be approached, something that had stayed with him for the next 4 decades, with the particular tenacity of truths that arrive before you have the vocabulary to categorize them. "You cannot take trust," his uncle had said, crouching beside him in the dust of the pen, speaking in the patient, unhurried way of a man who had nowhere else to be. "You can only make yourself the kind of thing it wants to come to." Emeka had thought about that conversation in a great many places over the course of his career. He had thought about it in the shallows off the coast of Valuria, neck deep in warm, alien water with a sand whale the size of a small building watching him with one enormous eye while he tried to earn enough permission to examine the parasitic colony that was slowly killing her. He had thought about it in a cave system on Thraxis Prime, sitting in absolute darkness 6 meters from a cave bear whose pain response had already put 2 Coalition Rangers in the medical bay, talking quietly to a creature that couldn't see him and couldn't understand him and was gradually, incrementally, deciding that the sound he made was not a threat. He had thought about it during the 6 hours with the Shadow Panther, the longest 6 hours of his professional life, sitting cross-legged on the cold floor of a Coalition wildlife management facility with a tin of preserved fish, and the specific kind of patience that was not really patience at all, but rather a complete and genuine willingness to fail, which was different. You had to be actually willing to fail. That was the part nobody taught in the textbooks. If you were sitting with an animal and waiting for trust and part of you was thinking, come on, I have places to be, I know you'll come around eventually, the animal knew. He didn't know how they knew. He had asked xenobiologists about it, and received a range of answers involving threat assessment chemoreceptors and micro-expression reading and low-frequency vocalization pattern analysis. And all of those answers were probably true. And none of them fully explained the thing he had observed in 30 years of field work, that the creatures he worked with could tell the difference between a human sitting with them and a human waiting them out. The second was a form of pressure. Pressure had a smell. He thought about all of this in the staff lounge on Deck 7 while Commander Silvani told him about Vorthanac, and he asked questions. Not about the wounds, not yet, though he would need those details, but about the dragon himself. About the Drathkai and their traditions around approach and contact. About what the previous medical teams had done and the precise order in which they had done it. about the bay's layout and environmental systems and atmospheric controls, about what Vorthanac had eaten last, if anyone knew, and how long ago, because hunger was a variable that changed everything, about the sounds he made, and whether the ship's translator had produced anything coherent, and what the staff observing him had noticed about the patterns of those sounds. Silvani answered everything. She was a precise observer and a precise speaker, and she had been watching Vorthanac for hours with the focused attention of someone trying to find a key to a lock she didn't have the design specifications for, and she had accumulated details that she had not known were relevant until Emeka's questions gave them a frame. He listened to all of it. He asked his questions in no particular hurry. He finished his cold coffee without noticing it was cold. When Silvani had told him everything she had and he had asked everything he could think to ask, he sat for a moment in the silence of the staff lounge with the ship humming around them both, and he looked at the table's surface and thought. Then he stood up and he said, "I'll need a few things from the fauna unit stores. I'll meet you at the observation bay in 20 minutes. He did not bring a full surgical kit. This was the first thing Silvani noticed when he arrived at the observation area outside Medical Bay 7, and it was the first thing that told her, not with certainty, but with the tentative credibility of someone who had run out of certainty and was working with what was available, that she had made the right call. Every medic who had previously approached Vorthanac had brought full equipment. It was the professional standard. You went into a treatment situation prepared for the treatment situation, kit organized, instruments accessible, everything needed ready to deploy the moment the opportunity presented itself. It was efficient, and it was correct, and it had, Silvani now understood, been precisely the wrong thing in precisely this situation, because a fully equipped medical professional moving toward a patient looked like exactly what it was, a person who had already decided what was going to happen. Emeka had a single bag over one shoulder. A soft bag, not a hard case, the kind of thing that didn't announce its contents by shape. In his jacket pocket, she could see the corner of something that turned out, later, to be a small cloth. In his other pocket was a compact scanner that he had specifically calibrated, he told her, to passive-only mode, meaning it would receive but not emit, no pings, no active sensor pulses, nothing that would register to a creature sensitive to electromagnetic variation. He would get no active readings from it. He would only be able to confirm things he could already see. He had chosen to be less informed in order to be less threatening, and he had made that choice without being asked. She watched him stand at the sealed door and look through the reinforced window, and she watched him take one long, slow breath, and she started to tell him what the others had experienced at 12 meters. "I know," he said. He didn't look back at her. He opened the door. The smell hit him the way it always did in these situations. The full, unmediated biological reality of a large creature in serious distress, which was nothing like the clinical environment that medical facilities tried to create and everything like the field. Burnt scale and iron and ozone, and under all of it, something else, a deep, hot mineral smell that he associated with the volcanic stone back home in a way that made no biological sense, but that his brain offered up anyway, the way brains did, reaching for the familiar in the unfamiliar as a way of maintaining its footing. The temperature was significant. Not dangerous for him, not yet, but noticeable, the kind of ambient heat that came from a biological furnace running hot with fever and metabolic stress. It pressed against his skin like a second presence in the room. He took all of this in within the first 2 seconds, not cataloging it analytically but simply receiving it, the way you receive the conditions of a new environment, filing them not under problems to solve but under reality to work within. Then he looked at Vorthanac. He had reviewed the sensor data. He had studied the visual records from the retrieval team and the observation footage from the previous treatment attempts. He thought he had prepared himself adequately for the physical reality of what he was about to encounter. He had not entirely. Some things did not reduce to data. The war dragon filled the bay the way a weather system filled a valley, not just occupying the space but altering it, changing the character of the air, the acoustics, the quality of attention that the space demanded. The dark patches on his scales were more extensive than the morning sensor readings had indicated. The wound beneath his secondary wing joint was visible even from the door, a dark channel against the surrounding scale that wept steadily, and the burns across his underbelly cast a faint, unhealthy luminescence against the bay's floor surface. And his eyes. The head came around with that same coiled precision that had been described in the observation reports, and the eyes found a mecha immediately and locked, and a mecha stood very still and let himself be looked at. He had learned early in his career that the first moment of mutual perception was an exchange. The creature was reading him, and resisting the impulse to look away or posture or immediately establish a non-threatening profile was paradoxically the most non-threatening thing he could do. Looking away was something prey did. Looking back, calmly, without challenge and without submission, was something else. "I see you," the posture said, "and I am not running." The sound from Vorthac's chest built like a furnace being stoked, low, resonant, traveling through the deck into the soles of a mecha's feet, and up through him in a way that his autonomic nervous system registered with considerable enthusiasm before his cortex overruled it. The amber eyes were extraordinary up close. Even in pain, even burning with fever and the particular wild alertness of a creature that had been in fight response for so long the response had become a state of being, there was a quality to them that stopped a mecha somewhere in his chest in a way he hadn't expected. Not just awareness, not just intelligence. Something accumulated, the look of a being that had seen a very great deal and had not yet decided whether any of it meant anything. Emeka set his bag down on the floor. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of each motion that communicated intention before execution, the way you telegraphed everything with a species that processed action and threat simultaneously and needed the frame of intention to separate them. Then he sat down beside it. Cross-legged, the way he always sat in these situations, grounded, symmetric, compact, taking up the smallest reasonable footprint. His hands went to his knees, open, palms down. Not palms up in the supplication gesture that some trainers recommended. He had never trusted that particular piece of advice because it was a gesture designed to communicate to humans, and he was not currently communicating with a human. He settled, the furnace sound continued, Vorthac's eyes did not move from him. The ridge of spines along the dragon's skull had risen, a detail from the observation reports he recognized, the equivalent of hackles, a preparatory signal, and the great head was oriented toward him with the absolute, unblinking focus of a targeting system. Emeka waited. He was genuinely waiting, not performing waiting. This was the distinction his uncle had been pointing toward all those years ago in the dust of a goat pen in Enugu. He was sitting with a war dragon who might choose to kill him, and he was not managing that fact from a distance. He was simply present with it, the way you were present with weather or gravity or any other condition that was larger than your ability to control it. There was, underneath the chemical alertness of his nervous system, a quality of stillness that was not bravery exactly and not resignation either, but something more like the acceptance that preceded useful action. He was here. He would remain here. What came next would come next. After 30 seconds, he began to talk. He talked about the river. He talked about getting up before dawn with his grandfather, who had a particular philosophy about the relationship between early rising and moral character that Emeka had never entirely agreed with but had come to appreciate in retrospect, and the way the air smelled on the walk down to the water in the dark. He talked about the specific character of West African river mist in the early morning, the way it sat on the surface of the water with a kind of settled authority, and the way the light came into it slowly when the sun began to move, not cutting through it but filling it gradually, so that the mist went from gray to white to a luminous pale gold without any single moment you could point to as the change. He talked about his grandfather's particular method of preparing the lines, the patience involved in the preparation, the philosophy his grandfather had spoken and unspoken both, about the relationship between how carefully you prepared for a thing and the quality of attention you brought to the thing itself. He talked about sitting in a small wooden boat in the early morning gold light and understanding, for the first time, that waiting was not a lesser activity than doing. His voice was low and even. He pitched it not to communicate content. The ship's translator was not relevant here, and he wasn't directing his words at the translator anyway, but to be a consistent, patterned, non-threatening sound in a space that had recently been full of sounds that meant threat and pain, and the approach of things that wanted to do things to him. He was providing contrast. He was providing the experience of a human voice that was simply there, not building toward something, not modulating in the urgency patterns that preceded action, not carrying any of the acoustic freight of a person with a plan. At the 4-minute mark, the furnace sound dropped an octave. Emeka did not change what he was doing. He noted it the way you noted a shift in wind as information, filed, not celebrated. The sound dropping was not trust. It was the beginning of the absence of immediate alarm, which was different, and he was not going to make the error of treating one as the other. He talked for 20 minutes before he moved. The first move was 3 feet. He picked up his bag slowly, explaining the movement before he made it. I'm picking up my bag now, just shifting position a little, and slid 3 feet to his right. Not toward Vorthanac. Laterally. Changing the geometry slightly without reducing the distance, which was a technique that reset the calculation for the creature being approached without triggering the specific alarm that direct approach produced. Vorthac's neck extended. The head lowered, tracking. The ridge rose again. The furnace sound climbed back up, not to its original pitch but higher than it had dropped to. Emeka sat. He talked. He waited. 15 minutes. Then another move, this time very slightly forward, combined with a lateral shift so that the approach component was a fraction of the total movement. The response was less than the first time. The sound climbed but not as high, dropped faster. He was learning the intervals. The space between what Vorthanac would tolerate and what he wouldn't was not fixed. It was a function of time and accumulated presence, and it moved as the accumulation grew. Each time Emeka sat in a new position and talked and was simply there without being a threat, the radius of tolerance expanded slightly. Not through pressure, through the weight of repeated disproven expectation. He was showing up close to the line and being harmless over and over until the line moved. This was the work. This had always been the work. It was not glamorous and it was not fast, and there was no technique that made it faster without destroying it, which was why it was the work that most people didn't do. 2 hours and 14 minutes after Emeka walked through the door, he was close enough to reach out his hand. He didn't touch the wound. He touched the leading edge of Vorthac's snout, the undamaged scales above the jaw line, well away from any site of injury, the equivalent in Emeka's practice of introducing yourself to a dog by letting them smell your hand before you reached for them. Firm, smooth scales, warm under his fingers, with the particular dense solidity of biological armor that had taken millions of years to develop. He touched them with the back of his fingers, not his palm, less surface area, less pressure, more deniable contact, the kind of touch that could be withdrawn without feeling like retreat. He held it for 3 seconds. Vorthanac was absolutely still. And then, slowly, with a deliberateness that matched Emeka's own, the great head lowered another few inches and settled. The amber eyes remained open, watching him, but the watching had changed quality, less the locked focus of a targeting system, more the watchful stillness of something that had made a provisional decision and was monitoring whether it had been correct. The breath that came from Vorthanac then was the deepest breath he had drawn since the retrieval team had brought him aboard. It moved through his whole body, shifting the vast architecture of his chest, and when it released it took something with it, some held tension that the body had been maintaining as a constant, exhausting default. And the sound of it, heard at close range, was one of the most profoundly tired sounds Emeka had ever heard anything make. He understood it completely. I have been holding myself together for a very long time, the breath said in the oldest language there was, and I am so tired. I know, Emeka said quietly to the dragon and to the breath, and to the simple fact of something having lasted as long as it had through sheer obstinate refusal to stop. I've got you now, we'll go slow. He opened his bag. He worked for 4 hours. He cleaned the burns first, the most extensive damage, the highest infection risk, the wounds that needed the most time. He used an irrigation solution that he warmed to body temperature before applying, working from the outer edges inward in the pattern that minimized the sensation of enclosure that large animals sometimes panicked at when treatment closed in around them from multiple angles. He talked continuously, narrating each action before and during it. I'm moving to your left side now. This next part will be cold for a second and then it won't be. You're going to feel pressure here, that's me, not anything sharp. The bio-gel he warmed between his palms. Both palms, rubbing them together until the gel matched his body heat, checking it against the inside of his wrist the way you checked milk temperature for an infant. Cold gel on a burn was a specific kind of shock. And shock produced flinching, and flinching near open wounds and shrapnel produced consequences he did not need. The shrapnel was the work that required the most trust, because it required tools, and tools required proximity, and proximity with tools was what every previous medical team had been trying to achieve. He introduced each instrument before he used it, held it where Vorthanac could see it, moved it slowly into range, made no sudden movements even when the work demanded precision that would have been easier with speed. He was slower this way. The wounds he was working in were slow to give up what they held. Twice, fragments shifted in ways that produced sound from Vorthanac. Not the furnace warning, but something more immediate and involuntary, the sound of pain that couldn't be entirely suppressed. Both times, Emeka paused. Both times, he kept his hands still and his voice steady and waited for the sound to pass before he continued. When he reached the wound beneath the secondary wing joint, the deepest wound, the one the scanner data said had infected material tracking into the secondary musculature, the wound that Salvani had told him was the primary reason the prognosis was 48 hours, the sound returned at a different frequency. Lower than the warning. More complex. A sound with history in it, the sound of something that had been enduring for so long that endurance was no longer separable from the creature enduring. Emeka felt it in his sternum. He looked up briefly from his work. Vorthac's head was resting on the deck plating, had lowered there at some point in the past hour, a gesture of such enormous significance that Emeka had registered it and said nothing about it, accepting it the way you accepted a gift by simply receiving it without making a production of it. The amber eye nearest him was open and steady, watching him work with an expression he had no established vocabulary for but that felt, in the unmediated way of things that bypassed language, like something between permission and appeal. "You are here," the eye said. "Finish it." Emeka did. He packed the wing joint wound last, working the bio-gel into the channel carefully, methodically, checking his coverage, applying the bioadhesive that would hold the seal while the deeper tissue began the process of doing what deep tissue did when given the right conditions and left to its purpose. He ran his scanner over the wound in passive mode, confirming depth, confirming coverage, reading the information available without interrogating for more. When he was done, he sat back on his heels. His hands were dark with bio-gel and ichor and a few other materials he would wash off later. His back ached from 4 hours crouched in positions calibrated for access rather than comfort. His voice was slightly rough from talking almost continuously for 4 hours, though he hadn't noticed it until just now. Vorthac's breathing had changed. It was not easy, not yet. Wounds of this extent didn't simply reverse because the immediate crisis had been addressed, and the infection work that had already started would take time and further treatment to resolve. But it was deeper. It had the quality of breathing that came from a chest that had permission to expand fully, rather than the shallow, guarded breathing of a body that had been holding itself braced against the next thing that was going to hurt it. Emeka put his instruments back in his bag one at a time, slowly, naming each one as he replaced it the way he'd introduced them when he took them out. He cleaned the bio-gel from his hands with the cloth from his jacket pocket, methodically, giving Vorthanac something predictable to watch while the weight of the past 4 hours settled into them both. Then he sat, cross-legged, in the same posture he had started in, with his hands open on his knees. He didn't say anything for a while. The bay was quieter than it had been. The ambient heat had not reduced. That would take longer, but something in its quality had shifted, the way the quality of a room shifted when whatever had been holding it at tension was released. Outside the observation window, he was aware of figures, had been aware of them for hours, the peripheral fact of the medical team watching. But he kept his attention inside the bay, inside the specific geography of this moment and what it required, which was nothing more or less than the simple willingness to remain. He had told his grandfather's story about the river to a war dragon tonight. About patience and mist and the early morning light coming into fog not by force but by being what it was until the fog made room. He thought his grandfather would have understood the application. Vorthac's amber eye remained open, watching him. The expression in it, if you had the vocabulary for what it was, and very few people in the galaxy at that moment did, was something that had not been there when Emeka walked through the door. It was the expression of a creature that had added one thing to its understanding of the universe. One small, specific, irreducible thing. That there existed, somewhere in the vast, indifferent dark, something that would sit with you while you hurt, and call that enough. What the dragon remembered the first week was the hardest. Not for Vorthanac, or not only for Vorthanac, though it was hardest for him in the ways that mattered most. It was hardest for the medical staff of the Endless Mercy, who found themselves navigating a situation that their training had not covered, and their professional frameworks had not anticipated, which was the challenge of providing ongoing treatment to a patient who had consented to exactly one person touching him and showed no inclination to expand that arrangement. The infection work alone required 3 sessions in the first 4 days. The burn treatment required daily attention for the first 2 weeks. The shrapnel wound beneath the secondary wing joint needed monitoring and redressing every 48 hours as the deeper tissue worked through its repair process. These were not optional interventions. They were the difference between the prognosis improving and the prognosis reverting to what it had been before a mecha walked through the bay door, and every single one of them had to be performed by a mecha on a mecha's schedule at a pace that Vorthanac would accept. The Medhari surgical team adapted. They had to. Televry, who was a professional of sufficient experience and self-possession to revise her methods when the evidence demanded it, spent several sessions observing from the observation area and taking notes with the focused attention of someone who understood that she was watching a technique she did not know how to perform but needed to understand. She communicated with a mecha through a small earpiece, questions about what she was seeing, requests for clarification on approach decisions, observations about wound progression that he needed to know but that she could not deliver in person without disrupting the specific equilibrium of the bay. It was not efficient. It was not the clean, multi-specialist process that serious wounds of this nature ideally received. Televry wrote in her private notes, with the candid frustration of a surgeon who valued precision above most other things, that treating Vorthanac through Dr. Okafor as an intermediary was like performing surgery through a very long pair of gloves, achievable, and producing acceptable outcomes, but requiring constant translation of intention into something a different pair of hands could execute. What she also wrote, in the same private notes, was that the outcomes in the first week exceeded her projections by a margin she could not account for on biological grounds alone. The infection responded faster than the pharmaceutical modeling predicted. The burn tissue showed regeneration rates at the high end of the range she had estimated for a Drathkai patient of Vorthac's age and condition. The wing joint wound, which had been her primary concern, the wound she had privately expected to cause lasting impairment even under ideal treatment conditions, was closing with a structural integrity that her twice-daily scans, delivered remotely, kept confirming, and she kept not quite believing. She raised this with a mecha on the 5th day during one of their debrief sessions in the corridor outside the bay. She was precise about it. Here are the projections, here are the actuals, here is the gap. What is your explanation? Emeka thought about it for a moment, leaning against the corridor wall with his arms crossed in the considering posture she had come to recognize as his processing mode. Stress response, he said finally. When a large animal is in sustained threat response fight mode, basically, the body diverts resources. Healing is expensive. It's not the priority when the priority is surviving the next 5 minutes. He paused. He's been in some version of threat response since before we pulled him out of the debris field. Probably before the battle ended, maybe a lot longer than that. Another pause. When the threat response eases, the body catches up. It has the resources now. It uses them. Televry looked at him. You're suggesting the primary variable in his recovery rate is psychological. I'm suggesting, Emeka said carefully, that the psychological and the biological aren't as separate as we treat them, and that a patient who isn't spending energy on being afraid of the people treating him has more energy for other things. Televry wrote that down too. She referenced it in her formal report 6 weeks later, attributed to clinical observation, and did not specify whose observation it was or in what context it had been made. The report was widely read in coalition medical circles and generated a small but serious conversation about large fauna treatment protocols that was still ongoing months afterward. The second week was different. Emeka had established his sessions, morning and afternoon, varying the timing slightly so that the rhythm was consistent enough to be predictable without being so mechanical that it removed all agency from the equation. He came in, he set his bag down, he sat for a while before he worked. The sitting before working portion shortened gradually over the first week, not because Emeka compressed it deliberately, but because the space it took up changed as the baseline between them shifted. What had required 20 minutes on the first day required 5 by the end of the week, and by the second week, it was less a discrete phase and more a natural opening, Emeka arriving, Vorthanac orienting toward him, a moment of mutual acknowledgement before the work began. On the 8th day, Vorthanac was awake when Emeka arrived. This was not unusual. He was awake for most of Emeka's sessions, and the sleeping posture he sometimes adopted mid-session, head lowering gradually to the deck as the work continued and the tension drained out of him, was something Emeka treated with the same careful non-acknowledgement he gave all significant developments, receiving them without performance. But on the 8th day, Vorthanac was not simply awake and oriented. He was watching the door from the moment it opened, not with the locked, targeting attention of the first days, but with something that took Emeka a moment to correctly identify. He was waiting. Emeka set his bag down and sat, and the low rumble that Vorthanac produced was different from any previous version of it. Not warning, not pain, not the involuntary sound of endurance. It was shorter and lower and had a quality of he reached for the word and settled on acknowledgement. It was the sound of a creature registering the arrival of something it had been expecting, the sonic equivalent of a nod. Emeka had worked with enough animals to know what that meant, and he was careful not to make anything of it, because making something of it would change it. He just nodded back, in the way that felt natural rather than calculated, and opened his bag and began his morning check. The afternoon of the 8th day was when Vorthanac moved. Not aggressively, Emeka registered the motion before it was complete, and his nervous system ran a fast assessment and found nothing to act on. Vorthanac shifted his head slowly and deliberately from its resting position on the deck to a new position approximately 4 feet closer to where Emeka was working. He did it with the same telegraphed, intentional quality that Emeka used in his own movements, each phase of the motion clear before it was executed, the whole thing communicating I am moving, this is how I am moving, this is where I am going. Emeka kept working. The gesture was, he thought about this afterward, in the debrief with Silvani that he gave every other day so the medical team had a record of session developments. The gesture was a form of reciprocation. Emeka had spent the first week moving toward Vorthanac by degrees, demonstrating approach as a non-threatening act, and Vorthanac had spent the first week receiving those demonstrations. On the 8th day, he had returned one. I can do this too, the movement said. I have been watching you do it. I understand now what it means. Silvani was quiet for a long moment after Emeka told her this. He is a very intelligent creature, she said finally, in the tone of someone revising an estimate they had thought was already appropriately high. Yes, Emeka agreed. By the 3rd week, the treatment sessions had evolved into something that neither the medical team's documentation nor the coalition's operational records had an established framework for, which was a characteristic of most things involving Vorthanac and Emeka that anyone who needed to write about them was beginning to find professionally frustrating. The wounds were progressing well, better than well, by metrics that Televry was now tracking with the specific attention she reserved for things that were teaching her something she hadn't known. The burn tissue was regenerating cleanly. The shrapnel wounds had closed. The wing joint wound was the last significant concern, deeper and more complex than the others. But even it was doing what Televry had begun, cautiously, to describe in her notes as unexpectedly cooperative. What the sessions looked like by the 3rd week was this: Emeka would arrive, and Vorthanac would track his arrival, and there would be the brief exchange of acknowledgement that had developed its own specific character. Emeka's nod, Vorthac's low rumble, a small ceremony of recognition between two beings who had negotiated their way to a working language. Then Emeka would do his checks and his treatment work, talking as he worked, and Vorthanac would make whatever sounds he made. And these had expanded considerably in range and frequency from the first days. The monitoring staff noted in their logs, from the warning sounds and pain sounds of the first sessions to a broader vocabulary that the translator still couldn't fully categorize, but that Emeka seemed to navigate without the translator's assistance. And then, when the work was done, Emeka would sit. This had started organically, the way things that became important often started, not as a decision but as a thing that happened and then kept happening because stopping it felt wrong. On the 3rd day, when the morning session had run long and been particularly demanding on them both, Emeka had simply not stood up when he finished. He'd sat back on his heels and then settled into his cross-legged position, and he'd talked, not about treatment, not about what came next, about his grandfather again, a different story, about a market day in Enugu and the smell of particular spices and the specific chaos of people gathered together in a small space for the purpose of exchange. Vorthanac had listened. He had listened with the full, focused attention that Emeka had learned over 3 weeks to read in him, the particular stillness that was not torpor but its opposite, the quality of a large intelligence doing the most active thing intelligence could do, which was receive. And Emeka had told his stories, one after another, with the same low, steady voice and no particular agenda, and the bay had settled around them into a quality of quiet that was not emptiness but occupation, a quiet that had something in it. By the 3rd week, the sitting after was as reliable a part of the session as the treatment itself. The medical team, monitoring from the observation area, had stopped logging it as unusual and started logging it as post-treatment rest period in their session records, a category they had invented specifically for this purpose. Televry, reviewing the logs, had the brief thought that rest period was probably not quite right, and that the more accurate category would require a word she didn't have in any of the 7 languages she was professionally fluent in, and she let it go and approved the category anyway. On the day Vorthanac was cleared for active duty, 6 weeks, 2 days, and some hours after Emeka had walked through the door of Medical Bay 7 for the first time, Commander Silvani authorized the formal discharge paperwork and then went looking for Dr. Okafor to tell him. She checked the fauna unit. She checked his quarters. She checked the secondary staff lounge on Deck 7, which had become associated with him in the way that certain spaces became associated with particular people, not because of any formal designation, but because of repeated presence. He was not in any of them. She went to Medical Bay 7. The door was open. She stood in the corridor for a moment before she looked in, because the open door was significant in a way she wanted to think about before she proceeded. In 6 weeks of recovery, the bay door had been kept sealed except during treatment sessions and the daily cleaning operations that Emeka had supervised personally, having established early on that Vorthanac would tolerate the cleaning staff if Emeka was present and running his quiet, continuous narration and would not tolerate them at all otherwise. The bay did not have an open door. The bay had a closed door and a window and a monitoring station that had been staffed around the clock since the day Vorthanac was brought aboard. The monitoring station was currently occupied by a junior medical technician who was very intently studying her console and demonstrably not looking at the bay door, with the specific quality of deliberate non-observation that junior staff employed when they had decided that something was above their pay grade to comment on. Silvani looked at the open door. Then she looked in. The bay was dimly lit. The night cycle settings, which the Endless Mercy maintained across all its non-critical spaces in the ship's artificial evening, had reduced the overhead lighting to approximately 30%. The orange starlight of the Gentara system, which they had not yet left, departure was scheduled for the following morning, contingent on Vorthac's discharge, came through the viewport in a long, low angle that crossed the bay floor and caught the edge of Vorthac's scales in the way that late light caught stone, drawing out a warmth and depth that wasn't visible in full illumination. Emeka was in the corner. He was slumped against the wall in the particular way of someone who had not intended to fall asleep, but had encountered sleep as an ambush, arriving for him faster than his defenses could respond to it. His jacket was folded under his head with the careful arrangement of a man who had paused to make himself slightly more comfortable before whatever he had planned to do next, which suggested he had known he was tired and had misjudged by how much. His kit bag was beside him, closed and organized. His tablet had gone dark in his lap, its screen the flat matte black of a device that had timed out waiting for input that never came. He had paperwork due. Silvani knew this because she had signed off on the notification that had gone to all involved medical staff 3 days ago regarding discharge documentation for Vorthac's case. The paperwork was, by most accounts, substantial 6 weeks of session logs, wound progression records, treatment notes taken in the specific format the Coalition's medical documentation system required, all of it needing to be formatted and cross-referenced and submitted before the Endless Mercy left the system. It was the kind of paperwork that a person doing a full-time treatment load on top of their normal fauna unit duties might have run slightly behind on, and which they might have sat down in a quiet bay late in the ship's evening to address, and which they might have been working on when something else intervened. Something else had intervened. Vorthanac was curled around him, not tightly, not in a way that trapped or enclosed. The great body was arranged in the broad, loose curve of a creature that had chosen a resting posture with deliberate care. And the tail, the last 6 meters of it, which had its own kind of mass and presence, was wrapped in a gentle arc around the corner of the bay where a mecha slept, not touching him but surrounding the space he occupied in a way that was unmistakably intentional. The gap between the tip of Vorthac's tail and the closest wall was approximately the width of a doorway, precisely the width of a doorway, Silvani thought, though she acknowledged she might be reading precision into what was simply coincidence. She was not sure it was coincidence. Vorthac's great head rested on the deck in the sleeping posture that a mecha had first witnessed on the 14th day of treatment. The posture that the Medhari nursing staff had been noting in their logs with increasingly emphatic annotations, because a war dragon adopting a full sleep posture in front of any member of the Endless Mercy's crew was, by every documented precedent for Drathkai behavior under stress conditions, not something that should have been occurring. His breathing was deep, and even the long, steady rhythm of genuine rest rather than the shallow defensive half-sleep he had maintained for the first 2 weeks. One amber eye was half open. It was tracking the door. Not with the furnace-hot alertness of the early days, the contained, focused burn of a targeting system running at full capacity. With something quieter and more settled, the quality of awareness that didn't need to be fully active because it had already made its assessments and reached its conclusions and was now simply watching. Monitoring. Present. When it found Silvani in the doorway, it held her gaze for a moment. She was a Medhari who had served in coalition medical operations for 31 years. She had treated patients of 47 different species. She had worked in active conflict zones and disaster response scenarios, and the long, difficult aftermath of things that didn't make it into official records. She was not, as she had told the liaison officer 6 weeks ago in front of a different window looking at this same patient under very different circumstances, an easy creature to unsettle. The amber eye held her gaze, and she felt, clearly and without any ambiguity, that she was being informed. Not warned, not threatened. The quality of it was entirely different from the warning she had witnessed through observation glass in those first terrible days. This was communication of a different register entirely, the kind that didn't travel through sound or translation matrices, but through the simple, ancient mechanism of one aware being looking at another and making something known. "He is here," the eye said. "He is under my protection. He is resting. You may leave." The Coalition had a word for what war dragons did in the field when they designated a member of their unit as being under their personal protection. It was Drathkai in origin, Vorthanac. And it appeared in the earliest records of Coalition Drathkai relations, in the accounts of the first joint operations, described by historians as a ritual behavior with roots in the pre-spaceflight era of Drathkai culture, when the great dragons had moved across a single world in units that were family and battalion simultaneously. In those records, Vorthanac was an irreversible designation, not a decision that was made and could be unmade, but a recognition of something that had already occurred on a level beneath decision-making, the formal acknowledgement of a bond that had formed before anyone thought to look for it. In the modern era, Coalition scholars who specialized in Drathkai culture noted Vorthanac in their academic papers as a historically significant practice, and described it, with the careful qualification of people who had never personally had occasion to test the assessment, as largely ceremonial in contemporary usage. The concept had evolved, the papers said, over the centuries of the Drathkai's integration into the broader galactic community. The intense personal protection dynamics of pre-contact culture had been mediated by military structure and professional context. The behavior persisted as a cultural artifact, present in tradition, occasionally expressed in symbolic form, but its old absolute character, the scholars generally agreed, was a matter of historical record rather than living practice. Silvani looked at the tail around the corner of the bay where a mecha slept. She thought about the Coalition scholars and their careful qualifications. She thought about the amber eye that had just informed her, with perfect clarity and no ambiguity whatsoever, of the current state of affairs in Medical Bay 7. She thought about 6 weeks of session logs, and the notes she had been accumulating in her private record that she had not yet decided how to formalize, because the professional categories available to her kept proving insufficient for the material she was trying to put into them. She thought about a human veterinarian from Nigeria who had walked into a bay with a dying war dragon, sat down on the floor, and talked about morning light on a river until something ancient and wounded and furious decided, against all its history and all its pain, that maybe there was one more thing worth trying. She closed the door. She wrote the report the following morning, in the 2 hours before the Endless Mercy was scheduled to depart the Gentara system. It was a formal recommendation, the correct channel, the appropriate format, the precise language that Coalition administrative systems required to process personnel attachment requests. And it was also, in the way that the best formal documents sometimes were, an act of recognition. It recommended that Dr. Emeka Okafor be formally attached to Vorthac's unit as a permanent large fauna support specialist. It cited treatment outcomes that exceeded projections by margins she documented precisely, because precision was the form her honesty took. It cited the development of a working treatment relationship under conditions that no previous medical protocol had achieved. And she described those conditions in the careful neutral language of a professional report while being quietly, stubbornly specific about what had actually occurred. She cited, for lack of a better term, exceptional interspecies communication skills, and she meant it as the highest professional commendation she knew how to give, even if the category it belonged to didn't officially exist yet. She did not mention the tail. Some things belong to the record, and some things belong to something older and more private than records, the territory where what had actually happened between two beings lived without needing documentation or category or the approval of any administrative system to be real. The Endless Mercy left the Gentara system at 0900, carrying its wounded toward the rear line facilities where they would complete their recoveries, and in Medical Bay 7, which would be reconfigured for standard use once its current occupant formally departed, but which no one had yet moved to reconfigure. Because the junior staff had developed a collective reluctance to initiate that particular process without very explicit instruction. Vorthanac stood at the viewport and watched the orange star of Gentara diminish with the expression that the monitoring staff had stopped trying to log in their reports because there were no adequate categories. Emeka stood beside him, not at a careful therapeutic distance, not in the measured proximity of a professional maintaining appropriate boundaries with a patient. Simply beside him, the way you stood beside something when you had been through something together and the something was over and what was left was the simple fact of still being there. They stood that way for a long time, the man and the dragon, watching a star get smaller while the ship moved them both toward whatever came next. The amber eye, reflected faintly in the viewport glass, held the same quality it had held since the 8th day, the look of a creature that had added something irreducible to its understanding of the universe. One small, specific, permanent thing, that somewhere in the dark, there was something that would sit with you. That this was, against all the weight of 47 battles and 6 star systems, and the long accumulating arithmetic of things that had tried to end him, enough. That it was, in fact, more than enough. That it was, in the oldest and most accurate language available to two very different beings standing together at a viewport watching a star shrink to nothing, everything.